The mahogany clock on Arthur Sterling's wall ticked, with the heavy, unhurried rhythm of a mechanism that had survived 3 generations of local banking. I sat across from his desk, watching the dust motes drift through the slanted afternoon light of his office. Arthur pushed his silver spectacles up the bridge of his nose, his eyes scanning the thick, leather-bound ledger before him. When he finally looked up, his expression was completely devoid of the polite sympathy he usually reserved for grieving families. He folded his hands precisely over the documents. He told me that the vintage silk garment I was asking about was not listed in the estate registry as personal property, but rather, it had been officially logged and appraised as the primary physical collateral for a commercial business loan. The silence that followed his words felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I looked at Garrett, my husband, who was sitting beside me. The tight, controlled grip Garrett had on his own knees was the only indication that he had heard Arthur correctly. My mind struggled to reconcile the sterile financial terminology with the deeply personal, fragile reality of what that garment actually was. I thanked Arthur, my voice sounding hollow and distant even to my own ears, and requested a printed copy of the lien. We walked out of the granite building and into the salty, biting wind of the Maine coast, carrying a piece of paper that unraveled a facade my family had maintained for my entire adult life. To understand the sheer audacity of what Arthur had just revealed, I have to go back to the humid evening 3 weeks earlier, when the heavy oak doors of the Vance family home were thrown open for my sister Elise's engagement celebration. Our mother had passed away 7 months prior, leaving the sprawling, slowly decaying Victorian house to both of us, but leaving the legal control of the estate entirely in Elise's hands. Elise was the older sister, the pragmatic one, the sister who possessed an MBA and a polished, impenetrable exterior. I was the archivist, the quiet sister who restored antique books and managed a struggling local bindery with Garrett. The division of labor seemed natural when our mother was dying. I handled the hospice care, the late-night panics, the physical toll of grief. Elise handled the paperwork. It was an arrangement born of necessity, one that left me entirely dependent on her goodwill for the disbursement of the funds Garrett and I desperately needed to keep our business afloat. The engagement party was supposed to be a return to joy for the Vance family. Elise's fiancé, a venture capitalist named Julian, had funded the lavish catering and the string quartet that played on the wrap-around porch. I remember standing near the punch bowl, feeling utterly out of place in a simple navy dress, watching the local socialites mingle. Garrett handed me a glass of water, his presence a steady, reassuring anchor in the sea of forced pleasantries. Then the music shifted. The low murmur of the crowd died down. I turned toward the grand mahogany staircase, expecting to see Elise making her grand entrance in one of the sleek, modern designer gowns she typically favored. Instead, my breath caught in my throat. Elise was descending the stairs slowly, smiling a perfectly practiced smile, wearing my wedding dress. It was a 1920s couture gown, a cascading waterfall of ivory silk and intricate glass beading that our grandmother had purchased in Paris. I had worn it 5 years earlier on the day I married Garrett. It was delicate, heavy, and carried the specific, irreplaceable memory of the happiest day of my life. After my wedding, I had carefully cleaned it, wrapped it in archival tissue, and placed it in the climate-controlled cedar chest in the attic of the family home. I had not given anyone permission to touch it. I took a step forward, my mind blank with shock, but Garrett's hand closed firmly around my wrist. He pulled me back just a fraction of an inch, enough to stop me from causing a scene. Elise reached the bottom of the stairs, and the guests erupted into applause. She walked directly toward me, her eyes locked on mine with a cold, calculating gleam that contradicted the bright smile on her face. Before I could form a single word, she turned to the crowd, raising her glass. She announced that she was wearing the dress as a tribute to our late mother, a beautiful family heirloom that I had generously gifted to her to mark the beginning of her new life with Julian. The guests murmured in approval, looking at me with sweet, patronizing smiles, touched by the supposed sibling bond. I stood paralyzed. If I shouted the truth, if I demanded she take it off right there, I would be the hysterical, jealous younger sister ruining a beautiful moment. More importantly, I would be antagonizing the sole executor of our mother's estate, just weeks before the final probate hearing. Elise knew exactly what she was doing. She was establishing dominance, testing the boundaries of my silence, using my precarious financial situation as a gag. I smiled tightly, nodded to the crowd, and whispered to Elise that she looked beautiful. Her eyes flickered with triumph, and she turned back to her guests. When Garrett and I finally left the party and climbed into our rusted sedan, the adrenaline left my body all at once, leaving me shivering in the warm summer night. Garrett gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at the dark coastal road. He asked me quietly why she would do something so unnecessarily cruel. I told him it was just Elise being Elise, a petty power play to remind me that she controlled the house and everything inside it. But in the days that followed, the rational part of my brain began to dismantle that explanation. Elise was arrogant, but she was never frivolous. She despised vintage clothing. She complained constantly about the smell of old fabric and the fragility of antique beads. She was a woman who valued sharp edges and modern luxury. Wearing a century-old fragile silk dress to a crowded party where people were drinking red wine was a massive risk, and Elise never took risks without a calculated reason. The first crack in her facade appeared when I decided to visit the family home while Elise and Julian were away in Boston for the weekend. I told myself I just wanted to retrieve my winter coats from the hall closet, but in truth, I was driven by a gnawing paranoia. I went up to the attic. The cedar chest was empty, but that was expected. What I did not expect was the meticulous state of the surrounding area. Elise had not just taken the dress, she had emptied the entire corner of the attic where our mother kept her personal financial records. The old metal filing cabinets were gone. I walked down to our mother's study, a room Elise had commandeered as her home office. The door was locked, but the old Victorian locks were notoriously simple, and I knew how to slip the catch with a stiff piece of plastic. The room was sterile, completely stripped of our mother's chaotic warmth. Elise's sleek laptop was gone, but the trash can beneath the desk was not empty. I crouched down and sifted through the crumpled papers. Most were mundane catering receipts and discarded drafts of seating charts, but near the bottom I found a torn piece of thick watermarked paper. It was a certificate of appraisal from a prestigious textile historian in New York, dated 2 months prior. The subject of the appraisal was the 1920s silk gown. The estimated value was staggering, reaching close to $90,000 due to its provenance and the specific designer. My hands trembled as I smoothed out the torn edges. Why would Elise have my dress professionally appraised? If she simply wanted to steal it, she would just keep it. Appraisals were for insurance. Appraisals were for leverage. I took the torn document home and laid it on the kitchen table. Garrett sat across from me, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands. He worked in logistics before we opened the bindery, and his mind naturally gravitated toward supply chains and documentation. He pointed out that an appraisal of that magnitude would require physical inspection. Elise must have taken the dress to New York or flown an appraiser up to Maine. That required time, money, and intent. It was not a spontaneous decision to wear it to a party. The party was a performance. The next morning I went to the local courthouse to pull the public records on Julian's new venture capital firm. It took hours of scrolling through microfiche and digital databases, but I found the incorporation documents. Julian's firm had recently secured a massive influx of capital, a bridge loan from a regional commercial bank. The bank listed on the document was the same institution our family had used for decades, the bank managed by Arthur Sterling. The puzzle pieces began to slide into a terrifying configuration. Elise was not merely keeping the estate from me out of spite. She was using it. I needed to see the estate accounts, but as a beneficiary rather than the executor, my access was severely limited. However, our mother had left me a small separate trust account at the same bank, independent of the main estate. I used this as a pretext to schedule a meeting with Arthur. I sat in his office, signed the routine paperwork for my trust, and then casually mentioned that Elise and I were working out the final inventory of the house. I asked, feigning innocent confusion, how the bank handled the physical assets stored in the estate's safety deposit boxes, specifically the antique textiles. That was the moment Arthur pushed his spectacles up his nose, looked at the ledger, and shattered my reality. The dress was collateral. Arthur explained with the dry precision of a man bound by regulations that Elise had applied for a commercial business loan in her capacity as the executor. She had presented a legal argument that the estate needed liquidity to maintain the property. To secure the loan, she had pledged several high-value assets from the estate, including the dress, which she claimed was joint family property. The bank had accepted the New York appraisal as proof of value, but commercial loans require the collateral to be securely stored and insured, often demanding physical audits. I asked Arthur, maintaining a terrifyingly calm exterior, when the last physical audit of the collateral had occurred. He checked his screen. He stated that the bank auditor had verified the presence of the dress 3 weeks ago, on the Friday before the engagement party. Elise had requested it be temporarily removed from the vault for a private buyer viewing, which was permissible under the terms, provided she signed a liability waiver and returned it within 72 hours. She had not returned it. She had worn it to the party, sweat in it, risked tearing the fragile beads, and then kept it somewhere outside the bank's control. But the far more devastating realization was that Elise had committed fraud. She had pledged an asset that belonged entirely to me, using her temporary power as executor to mask the true ownership. And she had funneled the loan money not into the maintenance of the house, but into Julian's failing startup. The engagement party wasn't just a celebration. It was a desperate attempt to project wealth and stability while she was secretly drowning in leveraged debt. Garrett and I sat in the car outside the bank for a long time. The anger I felt was not the hot, blinding rage of a sibling rivalry. It was a cold, precise fury. Elise had gambled my memories, my history, and my financial future to fund a lie. If I went to the police, it would be a messy, drawn-out family dispute. Elise would claim I was confused about the ownership. She would drag the probate out for years, and my business would go under long before a judge ruled on the matter. I needed a strategy that would force her hand instantly, without allowing her the space to spin a new narrative. I realized the weapon I needed was already in my possession. Elise needed my signature, for the estate to finally close, and for her to secure full legal title to the house, which I suspected she planned to sell to pay off the commercial loan. She needed me to sign a comprehensive waiver of claims. She had been pressing me to sign it for weeks, using my desperation for my half of the liquid cash as a bludgeon. I called Elise that evening. I kept my voice light, submissive, exactly the tone she expected from her defeated younger sister. I told her that Garrett and I had discussed it, and we were ready to sign the waiver. I could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, the poorly concealed relief. I added one condition. I told her I wanted to sign it formally at the bank, with Arthur Sterling present as a notary, to ensure that the immediate transfer of my cash portion went smoothly. Elise hesitated, her natural paranoia flaring, but her desperation outweighed her caution. She agreed. We set the meeting for Friday afternoon. The preparation for Friday became a military operation. I needed absolute proof of ownership that predated our mother's death, proving the dress was never part of the estate. I spent 2 days digging through Garrett's meticulous tax records from the year we got married. I found it, a rider on our personal homeowner's insurance, specifically listing the 1920s couture gown as my personal property, itemized and insured under my name at my address 5 years ago. I also printed the photographs from my wedding day, highly detailed shots showing me wearing the dress, alongside an affidavit from the seamstress who had done the minor alterations for me, explicitly naming me as the sole owner and client. When Friday arrived, the air in Arthur Sterling's conference room was thick with unspoken tension. Elise sat at the polished mahogany table, looking immaculate in a tailored grey suit. Julian was beside her, checking his phone repeatedly, exuding the nervous energy of a man who knew his empire was built on sand. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his notary stamp resting beside a stack of heavy bond paper. Garrett sat next to me, his presence a silent wall of support. Elise pushed the waiver across the table toward me. She offered a tight, condescending smile, telling me that this was for the best, that our mother would have wanted us to move forward without drawn-out legal battles. She handed me a heavy gold pen. I did not take the pen. Instead, I opened my leather portfolio and pulled out the insurance rider. I slid it across the table to Arthur. I asked him, keeping my voice entirely conversational, to verify the date and the named insured on the document. Arthur adjusted his glasses, read the paper, and stated that it was a policy in my name from 5 years ago. Elise's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, asking what an old insurance policy had to do with finalizing the estate. I pulled out the seamstress's affidavit and the high-resolution wedding photographs, sliding them to Arthur as well. I explained that I was simply ensuring all personal property was accounted for before signing a blanket waiver. I then looked directly at Arthur and asked him to confirm the exact description of the primary physical collateral holding the commercial loan against the Vance estate. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arthur looked at the photos, looked at the insurance rider, and then looked at Elise. The bureaucratic machinery in his mind was clicking into place, recognizing a massive liability. He stated, his voice devoid of any warmth, that the collateral matched the item in my photographs. Elise stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the wood floor. She began to speak rapidly, her voice rising in pitch, claiming there was a misunderstanding, that it was a family asset, that our mother had verbally promised it to the estate, but she was flailing. The paper trail was absolute. I remained seated. I looked at Julian, whose eyes were darting between Elise and the documents. I asked Julian if he was aware that his startup was funded by a fraudulent bank loan secured by stolen property. The color drained from his face entirely. He looked at Elise, realizing in real time that the wealthy, secure heiress he thought he was marrying was a desperate fraud who had just implicated him in a federal crime. I turned my attention back to Arthur. I informed him that as the sole legal owner of the stolen collateral, I was formally notifying the bank of fraud. I stated that I would not be signing the estate waiver, and I demanded an immediate freeze on all estate accounts, pending a full forensic audit. Arthur did not hesitate. His loyalty was to the bank's charter, not to the Vance family name. He calmly informed Elise that the commercial loan was in default due to fraudulent collateralization, and that the bank would be placing an immediate freeze on all associated accounts, including the operating funds for Julian's business. The silence that followed was not the heavy, oppressive silence of Arthur's office days earlier. It was the sharp, shattering silence of a structure collapsing. Elise did not scream. She did not apologize. She sat back down, staring at the mahogany table, stripped of every ounce of leverage she had ever held over me. Julian stood up, picked up his briefcase, and walked out of the conference room without saying a single word to her. The aftermath was a long, grueling administrative process, but it was a process I controlled. With the accounts frozen and the fraud documented, I petitioned the probate court to remove Elise as executor. The judge granted the petition within a week. I took over the estate. The bank forced Elise to liquidate her personal assets to cover the fraudulent loan, a process that wiped out her savings and forced her to move out of the Victorian house she had prized so highly. I eventually sold the family home. It was too large, too full of ghosts, and the money was more than enough to clear the tax liens on the bindery and secure Garrett and me a comfortable future. As for the dress, the bank retrieved it from Elise's possession a few days after the meeting. When they handed it back to me in a sterile plastic evidence bag, I took it home and laid it out on the spare bed. It was no longer pristine. There were faint stains on the hem from the engagement party, and several clusters of antique beads had been torn away, leaving bare threads. It looked exactly like what it was, a beautiful thing that had been used, damaged, and survived. I did not put it back in the cedar chest. I did not want the burden of preserving it anymore. I contacted a regional textile museum in Boston and arranged a permanent donation. The curator was thrilled to receive a piece with such historical significance. When I signed the transfer papers, letting the dress go forever, I felt a profound sense of lightness. The physical object was gone, but the autonomy I had reclaimed in the process belonged entirely to me. I thought walking out of Arthur Sterling's office that Friday afternoon was the end of the war. I thought the sight of Julian abandoning Elise in the conference room, taking his briefcase and his fragile startup with him, meant she was finally broken. I was incredibly naive. Removing her from the executor position was a legal victory, but I fundamentally misunderstood my sister's capacity for survival. The collapse of her engagement and the freezing of the commercial loan were not the end of her schemes. They were simply the destruction of her polite facade. With Julian gone and the bank demanding answers, Elise no longer had to pretend to be the grieving, responsible older sister. She became a cornered animal, and she turned all her remaining resources toward destroying me. The backlash began precisely 48 hours after the meeting at the bank. Garrett and I arrived at the bindery on Monday morning to find a heavy iron padlock secured to the front door, right above the brass handle. Pinned beneath it was a cease and desist notice printed on the letterhead of a very expensive, very aggressive Portland law firm. I read the document while standing on the wet pavement, the early morning fog chilling me to the bone. Elise had retained counsel over the weekend. Her new lawyer had immediately filed an emergency injunction against me, claiming that the bindery's lease, which had been originally co-signed by our late mother, was technically an asset of the unresolved estate. Even though the probate judge had temporarily suspended Elise as executor, her legal team argued that my actions at the bank were a fraudulent attempt to seize estate assets. They accused me of forging the insurance rider I had presented to Arthur Sterling. Garrett took the paper from my shaking hands. He didn't yell or curse. He just pulled out his phone and started making calls. Our business was small, and we operated on razor-thin margins. Being locked out of our own shop for even a week would mean missing delivery deadlines for 3 major university library restorations. It would bankrupt us. Elise knew this. She was cutting off our air supply, hoping to force me into a settlement where I would drop the fraud charges with the bank in exchange for the keys to my own livelihood. She was betting that my panic would override my desire for justice. We spent that entire Monday sitting in the cramped waiting room of a legal aid office, unable to afford the kind of corporate barracuda Elise had hired. When we finally spoke to an attorney, a weary but sharp woman named Helen, she explained the brutal reality of probate litigation. Elise's injunction was baseless, Helen said, but it was legally complicated enough to require a hearing. The earliest the court could see us was 14 days away. 14 days of zero income. 14 days of letting our clients down. Helen looked at me over her reading glasses and told me I had to prepare for a war of attrition. Elise's strategy was to bleed us dry legally and financially before a judge ever looked at the facts of the bank fraud. The psychological toll began to manifest in ways I hadn't anticipated. Our coastal town was small, the kind of place where loyalty is often decided by whoever controls the social narrative. Elise, despite her impending financial ruin, still held the cultural capital of the Vance family name. She began a quiet, methodical campaign to poison the well. I would walk into the local grocery store and notice the sudden, awkward silence from people I had known since childhood. The baker, who usually asked about my restoration work, wouldn't meet my eyes. A former high school teacher of ours cornered me in the produce aisle, patting my arm with sickening pity, telling me how worried Elise was about my mental state. Elise had apparently been making tearful phone calls to everyone in our mother's social circle, claiming that the grief of losing our mother had driven me to hallucinate, that I had stolen my own wedding dress from the family vault and orchestrated a manic episode at the bank to frame her. It was a brilliant, terrifying gaslighting campaign. She knew the bank's privacy policies prevented Arthur Sterling from publicly refuting her story. She knew I was too proud to go on a public apology tour defending myself. She was isolating me, making sure that even if I won the legal battle, I would be a pariah in the town where Garrett and I lived and worked. I started having trouble sleeping, waking up at 3 a.m, my mind racing with the agonizing fear that maybe I couldn't fight her. Maybe I should just call Arthur, retract the fraud claim, sign the estate waiver, and beg for the padlock to be removed from the bindery. But every time I felt close to breaking, I thought about the dress. I thought about Elise standing on the mahogany staircase, bathing in the applause of her guests, casually wearing my history as a prop for her own vanity. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the absolute violation of boundaries. I told Garrett that we were not going to settle. We were going to dig, and we were going to find the one piece of evidence that Elise's expensive lawyers couldn't spin. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Since the bindery was locked, I had been spending my days in the local library, using their free internet to research Julian's failed venture capital firm. I was trying to understand exactly why Elise had needed the $90,000 bank loan so desperately. If I could prove the loan was always intended for Julian's debts rather than the estate's maintenance, I could shatter her narrative of being a responsible executor. During my research, my phone buzzed with an unknown New York number. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened to the message, my heart stopped. The caller identified himself as David Lynn, a junior associate at the New York textile appraisal firm Elise had used. His voice was hushed, rushed, sounding like a man making a call he shouldn't be making. He asked me to call him back on a secure line. I rushed outside, standing in the library parking lot under a grey, drizzling sky, and dialed the number. David answered on the first ring. He explained that he had been the one to actually perform the physical inspection of the wedding dress when Elise flew the appraiser up to Maine. His boss, the senior historian whose signature was on the document, had barely looked at it. David told me that he had felt uneasy about the appraisal from the start. He said Elise had been intensely aggressive during the inspection, demanding they inflate the valuation based on the designer's name, rushing them through the provenance checks. But that wasn't why David was calling. He was calling because earlier that morning, Elise's new attorney had subpoenaed the appraisal firm's internal communications. In reviewing their files for the subpoena, David had found an email thread between his boss and Elise that had been left out of the official report. The thread contained Elise's original inquiry to the firm. In that email, sent weeks before she wore the dress to the engagement party, Elise had attached photographs of the dress to ask for a preliminary valuation. I gripped the phone tighter, the cold rain soaking my hair. I asked David what was wrong with the photographs. David's voice dropped to a whisper. He told me the photographs Elise sent weren't taken in the attic. They were taken in my home. He recognized the distinct wallpaper in the background of the photos, a custom William Morris print he happened to study. He had looked up my address, seen the real estate listing photos of my house from when Garrett and I bought it, and realized the backgrounds matched perfectly. Elise had not just taken the dress from the cedar chest in the estate's attic. She had broken into my house, photographed my property while Garrett and I were at work, and used those photos to solicit the initial fraudulent appraisal before she ever moved the dress to our mother's house to stage the theft. The implication was staggering. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was premeditated burglary. Elise had orchestrated the entire scenario, creating a false paper trail to make it look like the dress was an estate asset she discovered, when in reality, she had actively invaded my home to secure the collateral she needed to save Julian's company. I asked David if he could send me the email thread. He hesitated, explaining the risk to his job, the violation of client confidentiality. I didn't beg, but I kept my voice steady, telling him what Elise had done to my business, what she was trying to do to my life. I told him that if I didn't have proof of premeditation, her lawyers would bury me. There was a long silence on the line. Then, David told me to check my inbox in 5 minutes and hung up. When the PDF arrived on my phone, I didn't just see the email thread. David had also attached the metadata report of the photographs Elise had originally sent. The GPS coordinates on the image files were embedded in the code. They pointed directly to my living room. The timestamp showed they were taken on a Tuesday afternoon, a month before the engagement party, at a time when Elise knew both Garrett and I were at the bindery. I didn't take this to my overworked legal aid attorney. I didn't take it to Arthur Sterling. I printed everything at the library, placed it in a manila folder, and drove straight to the local police precinct. I walked up to the sergeant's desk, placed the folder on the counter, and told him I needed to report a breaking and entering, grand larceny, and a documented case of wire fraud. I handed him the GPS coordinates, the photos of my living room, and the email establishing intent. The sergeant looked at the documents, looked at me, and finally saw past the Vance family name. He saw a felony. The wheels of the criminal justice system turn slowly, but when presented with indisputable metadata and a documented paper trail of bank fraud, they turn with a devastating, mechanical precision. 2 days after I handed that manila folder to the desk sergeant, a pair of unmarked police vehicles pulled up the long, sweeping driveway of the Vance family home. I was not there to witness it, but in a coastal town as small as ours, The details spread faster than a storm tide. The officers did not come to negotiate or listen to Elise's polished excuses. They came with a search warrant for her electronics, looking for the original image files and the email correspondence with the New York appraisal firm. They also came with an arrest warrant for felony breaking and entering, grand larceny, and wire fraud. Elise's aggressive Portland law firm, the one that had locked me out of my livelihood just days prior, dropped her as a client the moment the criminal charges were filed. They were a civil litigation firm, and more importantly, they realized their client's assets were entirely frozen by a federal bank investigation. Without their backing, the baseless injunction against my bindery dissolved instantly. By Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the padlock had been secured to my front door, Garrett and I stood on the pavement with a court-ordered locksmith. The heavy iron lock was cut away, falling to the ground with a loud, satisfying thud. We walked back into our shop, the smell of leather, paper dust, and cold glue washing over me like the air in a sanctuary. We had survived the siege. The criminal proceedings against my sister stretched out over the following year, a miserable parade of preliminary hearings and plea negotiations. The town, which had so eagerly consumed Elise's narrative of my supposed mental breakdown, collectively turned its back on her. The sight of her being escorted out of our childhood home in handcuffs shattered the illusion she had spent her life cultivating. She avoided prison time by pleading guilty to a lesser charge of criminal trespass and paying full restitution to the bank. But the plea deal came with a massive fine, years of strict probation, and a permanent felony record. She was forced to leave Maine, moving into a small rented apartment out of state, completely severed from the Vance family name and the social power she had weaponized against me. I never spoke to her again. I felt no desire to seek an apology, nor did I feel the need to offer forgiveness. The silence between us was not a lingering wound, it was a necessary quarantine. I focused my energy on the present. With Elise permanently removed from the estate, the probate court finalized the transfer of the Victorian house to my name. Garrett and I did not hesitate. We sold the property to a developer who wanted to turn it into a boutique bed and breakfast. We used the capital to buy the building that housed our bindery, securing our business permanently against the whims of landlords or the threat of legal leverage. We expanded our restoration workspace, taking on more complex, delicate commissions from university archives across New England. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had defined my relationship with my family for decades finally evaporated, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of the life I had chosen to build. Late one November afternoon, the wind howling against the frosted windows of the shop, I sat alone at my workbench. Garrett was in the back room, packing a finished shipment. In front of me was a first edition 19th century volume of poetry, its spine cracked, its pages brittle and stained by time. I picked up a bone folder, carefully smoothing a piece of Japanese repair tissue over a fragile tear in the paper. I worked slowly, applying just enough paste to mend the damage without altering the original character of the page. There was no audience, no applause, and no performance. There was only the quiet satisfaction of taking something broken, something almost lost to carelessness, and making it whole again with my own 2 hands.